Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hole Design 101, and today we're looking at the mid-length par 3. Now for the purposes of this video I'm terming that as anything where you're going with a mid-iron, so not a wedge, not a long iron. So I'd call that between around 150 and in-game 190. These holes are really your bread and butter of your par 3s, so we're going to look at ways in which you can ensure they're varied, as well as ensuring that each hole on its own can sing. For me, the two key words are balance and character. Now in terms of character, how are you making that hole stand out and be memorable within the context of the round? And in balance, how are you making sure that it fits with the rest of them and complements the other par 3s on the course? Now those might be long par 3s, short par 3s, what have you, but it's got to fit in as part of the group. So we're going to start by looking at the first one, which is character. Now how can you make that individual par 3 really stand out? We're looking at 7th here at Marlette Fells, which was my course from last year's rookie design contest, and you can see first of all it's got a really nice little green site. It's pretty natural, but it falls between two other holes and works really well. Now in terms of character though, really you're just hitting a 7 or 8 iron, so how can you make that shot interesting? Well, the thing that I did that I really liked on this, and I've tried to replicate since and never quite got right, was this lovely little spine just here that's going diagonal. You can see the pin is just on one side of. Now for the back pin, that therefore means that you're going to have to land a ball just short of it and try to roll it over. So if we're looking at the shot that we're going to play, we are looking at trying to land, in this case, rather than carrying an 8 iron all the way there, in which case we're likely rolling off the back, well, are we playing a 9 iron and just landing it slightly short and rolling over? How are you managing to do that? How far right are you going? How far left are you going? The further left and out the pin you go, the more you're taking that on. Now this slope isn't severe, but you don't really, if you're putting over it, in reality, to get it close, the margins are extraordinarily tight. To have a putt anywhere on here will be absolutely fine, but if you're too greedy and go dead at the pin, then you're going to be punished and you're chipping back up. Again, not a difficult chip, but something that you'll remember. Leaping into another hole on the same course, and this is the second, you'll see it's 190, so a little bit longer. That in turn is going to lend it with something slightly different to the previous one, but also we're slightly uphill. That lends it. But in terms of the character, what are you going to really remember about this hole? Well, it's the green flowing massively right to left, which means that shot is requiring something a little bit different, because in the game, you don't really know, you don't have that feeling of real life golf whether you're hitting an 8 or a 6 iron. Yes, it matters because of how it rolls out, but it's not quite the same as in real life. Whereas how the ball reacts when it hits the ground, how it rolls out, how you have to envision that shot and play it creatively. You've got this bunker here and pin 1 is just tucked behind it, but you can use that slope and roll it along. You do have to factor in the elevation change, but there's a way to get the ball to the pin that's interesting, and it's the sort of shot you might remember. So again, when we talk about character, what does that really mean in terms of the green? Well, it's how does the hole play? How does this hole play very differently to the other one? Rather than just pulling a stick back, are you making the player do something slightly different? And now one final example of kind of this idea of character, or the green having one specific feature, might be the second at Greenstone River, where you've got a really clear plateau on the back. There's a bit of internal contouring that adds interest with this little spine here, and that deflects balls from one pin to another. So you've got a pin here and a pin here that are going to play a little bit differently and hopefully memorable. But the main feature for me with this one was always that slope off to the side. And in this game, particularly where some people hit fast, some people hit slows, and perfect tempo is harder and harder to gauge, can you give people something that makes them think about, well, I really don't want to miss there, but I'm okay with missing here? With this one, you're trying basically to challenge that right edge as much as you possibly can, but knowing that if you go too close and over, you're facing a nasty little flat splash shot back up. So the next concept we're going to discuss is the one of balance, and this for me is the most important one because it kind of takes all of your par 3s into equation, and that's really don't test the same thing twice, or don't show the same thing twice. Now this goes for both aesthetics and how it plays. Now currently we're looking at the 5th at Saxondale, which for my money has the most varied and interesting set of par 3s you will find. This is by PithydoctorG, and Dan was kind enough to lend me the file for this. Now in terms of balance, we're going to look at distance, we're going to look at elevation change, we're going to look at direction. Those are your 3 main things. And you'll see with this course in particular just how good a job that he did of making sure that each par 3 played differently. So we're now back in the designer and we're going to look at Dan's par 3 collection, and you'll notice that with a par 69 there are 6 par 3s, so immediately he's going to have to do some really good work, or he's got a difficult task of making sure that none of them feel boring. Now the first one we're going to look at, we're looking at distance, direction, and we're looking at elevation last of all. So can you vary within those 3 things and the environments that the holes sit in, and make sure that each hole you've given it a fighting chance of playing differently before you really even do the hard work of touching the green or hazards, etc. So first one, we're looking from blue tees, and you'll notice I've laid this compass point up. So the first one is playing northeast if you want. We then go to 5 plays south. We then go to 9, which plays northwest roughly. We then go to 12 plays over to the east. 14 plays southwest, and 17 finally plays northwest. So you've got a variety of different compass points. Now why is that particularly important? Well, wind, most often you don't want all of your par 3s playing into a headwind, or all of them playing away from, like playing into a crosswind, or it becomes a little repetitive. And even if you've changed the distances of the holes so they're all, like you've got one at 180, one at 160, one at 140, if you put the 141 downwind and the 181 up into a headwind, you're likely playing the same length of shot. Let's go look at distances. So this one's, and we're going to look at those in tandem with our elevation change. So hole 3, we've got 195 and the green is slightly raised, so slightly elevated green, which, and Dan does this really well, gives you this possibility of kind of having a little bit of an infinity green look at the back. He did this brilliantly on, if you look at Shelter Island, this 9th hole there is a consummately, it's just a perfect par 3. So really well done. Go and have a little look at that one. We look at 5. 5 is going to be slightly downhill, I think. Oh no, sorry, 5 is uphill slightly again, 6 feet, not much. Although it doesn't look it because you're looking over this big valley, which again gives you a feel of elevation change that isn't necessarily there. Now in terms of distance, this one's 184, but we talked about the importance of it playing completely differently. Well, no matter what wind you've got, because he's varied the direction, these are going to play differently. 9 is a funky one that we'll come back to later on in the video, but you're looking at northwest-ish. It's playing down 36 feet, so really low down, which exposes that view in the background. It's quite nice. And it's 188, so quite, again, all 3 of them so far have been quite long. Now if there were one thing you might nitpick about this, maybe you suggest that the first 3 are slightly long compared to, you might want a wedge shot in, but it's going to depend on how they play, and Dan does a really good job of changing how they play even though they're quite long. 12 was a long par 3, so 217, so we're not counting that as our mid par 3, but we'll keep looking at it anyway. It's uphill 10-ish feet again. 14 then is downhill and does count as one of our mid par 3s. It's downhill about 17, and again he's pulled that little infinity green out there, and this one is just miles over the edge, so you get a really different feeling with this one. But we're thinking about how it's going to play. Wind, elevation, probably taking a different club, and the fact that it's 155, well, with that elevation change you might even be just taking a pitching wedge. And then finally you had 17, which I believe was the longest of the bunch. Yeah, 234, a tiny bit uphill. But this one features a huge amount of fairway, no bunkering to run it in, and you've basically got all world left to funnel the ball in from. So again, it's going to play very differently. But what I'm hoping you've seen from this is you've got to view your par 3s as a group. So although he's got 6 of them, none of them are going to play the same, partly because of the work he's done, well, pretty much entirely because of the work he's done on distance, direction, and elevation. He then further enhances that with his green shapes and contours as well, and we'll come back to some of those later. So the next thing we're going to want to talk about is environment, and the main thing people remember par 3s for, both in real life and in the game, is that they look stunning. And you've got to really therefore work hard to make sure that these are some of your best looking holes, particularly if they're your mid par 3s where you're not hitting a wedge, you're not hitting a long iron. There's no inherent real interest there other than let's make the thing look really beautiful. So here we're going to look at a few of them on South Yarra. And you'll notice that not only do each of them hopefully look pretty good, they're going to look kind of different in terms of the environment that they inhabit. And so having seen 4 flyovers-ish of our kind of shorter mid-par 3s, how do you accomplish this? Well, firstly, it's finding green sites that are going to make sense, whether it be in a little glade, so we'd seen that with Marlette, but you've got this little oasis of calm, which I quite like, for this idea that you're in the middle of trees and you've got dense tree line. There's nothing other than you and this one shot, which I think you can do on a par 3 in a way that you can't do with any other type of hole, because you're setting the shot up from this one position. There's no worrying about getting to this point, or what if people miss. You are putting everyone in exactly the same spot. Now, in terms of looking for your green sites, one of the things I quite like doing is allowing you views of other holes from the par 3, or seeing the par 3 coming. We talked about this again in the short par 3 video, but you'll notice on 9 you get a sight line through to the first green, which you'll have already played. The 7th, I think, is kind of in its own little area again, but it feels a bit more dense and wooded over here than it did on the other one. And this one, I like the idea of you can see absolutely nothing else. It's just you and this one shot, compared to 3, where you're still getting a little bit of a view over 4. Yeah, the holes are slightly out of order for the moment. And finally, you've got that view on 11, which will eventually be 14, where it's looking over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fairways, and a couple of greens as well. And you want to think about do you want that par 3 being kind of the centre of attention and you're seeing this green from miles off and wondering when you're going to get there, or do you want it to be a little bit more secluded? Again, it's a good way of getting a bit of balance. You might also want to use your measure tool, put it on the middle, and this is a trick from PS Petty, and come up with these sort of little windows for sight lines. Now, I did this particularly with this green because I wanted you to be able to see so many different points from here. So if we're just going to go through and look at what you might be able to see from this one vantage point, you'll notice some of the work that I've done to ensure that some of the big features will be things that you can see. Now, it might depend on which pin you're going for, but you'll notice all of the different things that you can see from just this one green site. We can also see 10 fairway there, we can see 1 fairway there, we can see a little bit through the trees here to this bunker, which will also then become the second fairway. You kind of get the idea. There's going to be loads of stuff because I've deliberately seen this green coming. We've known one of the cornerstones of the routing was going to be that I had this downhill long par 3 with just this great view over everywhere else, and I routed the course knowing that I was going to get to this. So a far shorter little clip here, but we're back at Kaiuma Bay, which had 4 par 3s, 3 of which were on the back 9. There was only 1 on the front 9, and you might remember from having seen this course, you've got cliffside, you've got inland holes, and you've got this little creek. Now, it's no accident we used all 3 of those different types of environment within the same course and with our par 3s. So 6, you're looking at 144, so maybe a little short for a mid par 3, but it's still not necessarily a wedge, particularly to a back pin, which is pin 1. And this one's kind of the inland hole that we were looking for. You get these big views over the rest of the plot. You've then got 13, and this is 170 odd yards, and this one really features the cliffside in a big way. So particularly pin 1, which was that little one right on the edge, you're going to feel like you're taking on that spectacular cliffside top view. The final one was then 15, which was across this little river, which you might remember we had on we talked about in the routing video. Now, this one again, it's not massively in play, it's more for visual breakup, and the par 3 itself is more just to do with the green complex than anything else for this one. Back at Saxondale, and then the next thing that I think you can use to really help you set yourself up for success with variety is green shapes. Now, Saxondale was the obvious one for me in coming and looking at this, because Dan used some really interesting and very funky greens on his par 3s in particular, and part of that was this Tobacco Road inspiration that he had along with the English heathland stuff. But you'll notice for example, 5 we're going to contrast with 9. Now 5 is this really narrow, long green. If you'll notice, it goes anywhere from 150 to 210. So a 60-yard long green doesn't look ridiculous because it's also really narrow. This one is really testing more than anything club selection, distance control, but also the green has some interesting contours to it. But here you want to think, using your green shape to help you, what sort of shot are you getting the player to hit? Here we're focusing on distance control. We're talking about vertical accuracy. Now if we flip over to 9, you may remember seeing this one earlier, and 9, look at what 9 does. 9 is this tiniest green, and I would recommend that you would probably want to make this green a little bit bigger for the new game, but he does help you with some of the contouring and the elevation change. But here what we're looking at most of all is your lateral misses. So look at this little spine here. If you are going for this pin and you're ending up left of that, that's a nightmarish putt. And all 4 of these pins are going to play really differently. This hole I know was pretty Marmite for a few people. There were some people who absolutely loved it. For some people it was just a little too quirky. But what I think it does exemplify better than any other course is here are 2 green shapes that are forcing you to do vastly different things, even for what might be relatively similar length holes. If we then go and look at, say, 12, well, 12 a longer par 3, but you've got a little bit more space. You can also land it slightly short and left and right, and it will funnel on. You've got a big backstop as well. And finally, 14 was the other obvious one, where you had this kind of slightly banana-y shaped green, which allowed him to have the cape sort of pin, so tucked on this tiny corner, and you could also funnel down towards that as well. It was nicely sculpted to help. But again, green shapes wise, these are very, very memorable. They might be a touch too quirky, I would say, for most designers. You have to be really, really good to pull this sort of stuff off. But they made each of these par 3s really, really memorable. And again, also with the distances he was letting you hit, so 180 through to 130, and the way he made the greens pretty narrow but at different angles, that asked you to hit slightly different shots every single time. We're going to finish up at Greenstone by looking at the other aspect of greens, which is the contouring. And I've chosen Greenstone partly because I think the contours are really bold, they're less kind of subtle than my current ones, but also because I think it shows a really good variety of just ways in which you can challenge a golfer. So I think here you've got a really obvious one with a plateau. So it's 1.5 feet up, it's quite high, but you'll notice that there's a simple challenge here, which is, can you get it on the right level? That's one way to do it and add interest. If we then nip forward to the next par 3, we have a short par 3, which you'll have seen in the previous video, and that one's just bonkers, right, because it's a short par 3. I think again a key message would be, if it's on the shorter range of the mid spectrum, treat it to be different to the longer range. Like your 150 par 3 green should be different to your 190 par 3 green. You shouldn't be having a 5-iron into this green, but you could accept a wedge into this green, for example. If we flip over to 11, which is one of our middle-ish par 3s, I think that's 150, 160 odd. This one's, you can tell immediately, less severe than the previous one. We're talking about our environment as well. We've got overlooking the big river that we'd set up on this course. You've also got interesting internal contours on this one. You've got a swale down this side, a spine that can allow you to funnel over to this pin, a front one with a little bit of a kicker but also a little bit of a false front, and a spine here, a back one you can funnel down to or go straight at, but the idea was always that you tried to work a draw in and around through the channel, and one just dead in the middle. This one's maybe, I would probably tone down some of these contours if I was doing it now, but I think they're really clear that you can funnel the ball to different pins differently on this one. So it gives you an idea of some of the ways you can do this. Now, 13 was a really long par 3, 2, 4, 6, and this one I wanted to basically encourage you to use the ground and not carry the cliff as much. You could land here and roll on, and generally this was pin 1 and you could funnel down to that pretty easily. There's a little bit of a mound there which pushes you back into this sort of spot for pin 4, I think. Pin 4, correct. And then these two, you were trying to roll it just gently down the slope. So with this one, it was really trying to, yes, you've got that there if you wanted to go straight at it and carry it, but the aim was always going to be, well, can you use the ground to basically land it short and roll it on, or think about rollout. So again, asking you a different question to the previous ones. And then the final one on this course was 17, which is an Eden green. This was all templates, this course. They're not necessarily the best interpretations, but they were my trying to learn about templates phase. Now, the Eden green is basically severely sloped back to front. So you'll notice there's 3.5 feet of elevation change between front and back, and that's huge. And the challenge of this hole is always not just can you hit the green, but can you stay below the hole. So for the front pin, you are asking people to land really, really short, and basically you're saying to them, well, okay, it's 182, you're hitting a 7 iron, either you're stopping it on a diamond, just feeding it on, or you're having a slippery downhill putt. I think were I doing this again now, I'd allow a bit more fairway around the front of the green, which would make that shot a bit more manageable. I think carrying it all the way is a little harsh. But then these 3 pins, this one's a little dicey because I wanted to put a tier on it because I didn't know much better. You can also, think about how you can manipulate where people leave the ball. So can you have one that is bunkered really severely on one side and you put a pin over it and say, well, if you want to go straight at it, there's your danger. But then make sure that on other holes you're not bunkering it always this way. It's also worth mentioning at this point as a final closing thought, you probably have some default tendencies with par 3s, ways which you see them easier than others. For me, I always tend to see a par 3 going front right to back left. It's like my natural, that's how I want the green to work. I find it far harder to look at a piece of land and see this sort of direction. And it's a weird one, but everyone will have some sort of tendency there. It might also be where you put your bunkers. So keep comparing all of them and work out if you're doing the same thing twice. So I hope that this video has helped with a few of the concepts around ensuring those mid-length par 3s retain some interest. As I say, the key is that concept of character, which is difficult to nail down, but also that one of balance. Like, make sure that they all play differently, and you've got to think of how the player is going to just enjoy that round. Oh, idiot. So I hope that this video has helped and given you a bit of an idea on how to build out those par 3s. Again, if they're mid-length, the 2 main things to look for are your character and balance. So character being tricky to define, but what makes that hole interesting in and of itself, whereas balance is how does it fit with all the others that you've produced. Thanks again to PithydoctorG for the Saxondale file, and hopefully that gave you some tips, and we'll see you again soon.